Greetings from the Tennessee World Affairs Council and welcome to our Global Dialogue webinar series. My name is Liane Henschke, Executive Director of the Council, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization whose mission is to equip Tennesseans with the global understanding and civic confidence needed to translate world affairs into opportunity, leadership, and informed participation. We advance this mission through the following programs: our webinar series, Distinguished Speaker Series, our in-person events, we have 16 every year, the education program named Student Leaders Without Borders, and Global Leads. Please access our website on the tnwac.org for more information. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. João de Castro Neves, a Senior Director for Global Strategic Risks at ExxonMobil. He will present remarks on how multinational corporations are adjusting to a world shaped by geopolitical tension, regulatory uncertainty, and economic fragmentation. Ms. Carolyn Buccerone, the moderator of today's webinar, is a Senior Vice President and Associate General Counsel at AllianceBernstein and a TNWAC board member. We will have around 10 minutes for Q&A, so please use the chat to ask questions to the speaker. But let me introduce the moderators of today's webinar. Since joining AllianceBernstein in 2018, Ms. Carolyn Buccerone played a key role in managing legal affairs related to the company's international asset management business, including international fund platforms, global employment legal issues, and data privacy compliance. She also serves as a counsel to the Investment Committee and AB's Lux Fund boards, providing strategic legal guidance on investment decisions and fund management. Before joining AllianceBernstein, Ms. Buccerone served as legal counsel at UBS. She earned her JD from Rutgers University School of Law in 2004. In addition to her professional responsibilities, Ms. Buccerone is actively involved in AllianceBernstein Social Response Committee and is former co-chair of AB Synergy, the firm's employee resource group dedicated to promoting a culture of community and belonging for the firm's female employees. In the community, she serves the Nashvillians to the Legal Aid Society of Middle Tennessee and the Cumberlands. Thank you both for being here today, as well as the participants of today's webinar.
Thank you, Liane, for the introduction. And I'm thrilled to be here today with Dr. João Castro Neves to join us for Tennessee World Affairs Council Global Webinar Series. And specifically on this very timely topic. Before we dive into the discussion, I'd like to just share some of João's incredibly impressive background, and you'll see why we couldn't think of anybody, wouldn't have anybody else talking about navigating geopolitical risk. So João has 2 decades of experience in political risk analysis, government relations, and external affairs, and has advised senior executives, investors, and multinational organizations on how to navigate geopolitical uncertainty. Before joining ExxonMobil, he was director for Latin America at Eurasia Group, where he covered political and economic developments across the region. He has an incredible amount of experience leading multidisciplinary teams to deliver strategies that align institutional priorities with communications and external engagement goals. João has helped on initiatives across government and civil and private sectors. On a personal level, he was born in Rio de Janeiro, raised in London, Brasilia, Washington, D.C., and Ottawa. So incredibly fitting background, and I'm sure I didn't do it full justice, but you will see as we go through our discussion the incredible expertise that he has in this area. So, Joe, thank you again for joining us. We're thrilled to have you.
No, my pleasure. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Liani. And I'd like to extend my thanks to the Tennessee World Affairs Council. It's a pleasure to talk to you guys about this.
Great. And I know we have a lot to cover in a short period of time, and so I'm going to sort of jump right in with a big sort of topic. I think a good starting point for us is to sort of ask you to share your thoughts on why this topic matters now, and how did geopolitics sort of come to the forefront of strategic decision making for multinational corporations?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And I think that's the big kind of discussion nowadays. That kind of the obvious thing to say, and I think it's the kind of the title of this conversation is that, the world is much more volatile and fragmented now, right? But that's kind of a simple way to put it. But if you just take a step back and just think about the last, let's say 6 years, right? 2020 till now, the amount of shocks or geopolitical shocks that we've had is just enormous, right? You think about a once in a century pandemic, right? That we had with all the effects that it had, a land war in Europe, crisis in the Middle East, a number of conflicts, deepening conflicts in the Middle East. Trade and tariff, disruption in the trade or globalization infrastructure that the world has seen, in the last few years, sanctions and all the disruptions and energy insecurity and everything. So just last 6 years, the amount of events that have, impacted the geopolitical events that have impacted how we live and how companies operate is just mind-boggling. And then for someone who went to school early on, doing studying political science and a lot of these issues, I needed to explain a lot what the relevance of what I did 20 plus years ago. Whereas now it's like, oh, okay, this actually matters. You're bringing these issues that, for large corporations or many corporations around the world, these events that I mentioned, they shape, capital allocation, they shape supply chains, they shape reputation, they shape a number of things, right? So the main point is that nowadays geopolitical risk is no longer just background noise, right? Geopolitical risk is more kind of a part of the core business, how companies make decisions about investments, how they operate, reduce risk and try to anticipate some risks going forward. Because what we used to be separate boxes, geopolitics here, compliance, security, and now it's everything comes together and they're kind of going the same direction. So we need to understand that in a more holistic view. And when you look how to, you try to think about these issues and how they impact the world and what trends may stem from it, the goal here, I mean, my goal is not to be right, is to be ready, right? Meaning you need to think about all these uncertainties and prepare for them. So, I mean, there is a whole business of being right, and I think that's forecasting and things like that that we know, but that's not the goal here. The goal is to kind of think about possible futures and trends and how they, in different ways, they may impact a business and how the business operates. So the goal is to be ready to face those challenges, I would say.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think being ready, not right. Interesting way to phrase that. And I think, I guess I'd be interested also to hear a little bit more about your kind of personal trajectory, because as you explained to us the idea that you used to have to tell people why it mattered, what you did, and now it's on sort of everybody's front of mind, how your kind of personal trajectory mirrors that of the work itself, and from academia to government service, private institutional service. How did it all kind of culminate here at this time, in this role?
Well, short answer is it was completely accidental, maybe non-linear. In hindsight, it all makes sense. I would say the hindsight 2020. But yeah, there was a bumps in the road, and again, I I thought about going, studying architecture and then journalism and economics, and then I landed in political science. Oh, this is interesting. That it began, more academia, thinking about, doing my graduate school, graduate studies on that area as well. I always loved foreign policy and international relations. So I had a foot in academia. Then I did a brief stint in the Brazilian Federal Senate as well, which is a great opportunity to learn how democracy works, right? How Congress works, and the famous, how a bill becomes a law, that I think applies to a lot of different congresses around the world. And then by accident, I got invited to do a consulting job on political risk that I didn't quite know it was a thing. Kind of instinctively I knew, but I didn't know it was an actual career out of it. So I had these multiple works or activities going. Some would say underperforming on all fronts. Trying to do a little bit of all. But it gave me a bit of a comprehensive view on what I do. So. And then from that, doing this political risk more at the local level, I was in Brazil back then. I did all my academic career, undergrad, graduate school, PhD in Brazil, and but I love the research. I love the academia, the amount of work that went into that. But I felt that I wanted to do something that had more kind of real world, quote unquote, impact in the sense that so explaining how politics affects business environments, business decisions, right? So I think as this kind of progressed, and you mentioned the Eurasia Group was when I came to the US 16 years ago, it was interesting to see how that, political risk became, quote unquote, an industry, right? Where, you go in and you talk to investors across the board, or more broadly, decision makers, because you also talk to government officials, you talk to, investors in the financial world, in the corporate economy, how politics matters, right? And for a lot, just simple example. I mean, you discover a specific country, and you have to try to have outlooks for what the country is going to look like in a few years' time. So you have to try to see how elections matter. So the result of the election is not necessarily the end of your analysis, right? It's the beginning of the analysis, because then you have to think about what that government is going to look like, in terms of policies to specific sectors, so in a nutshell, kind of when you look back, I went from all these different experiences, which were interesting. I learned a lot from different angles, from more of a research side, academia, more kind of a business, translating that into business relevant insights. But nowadays, I think for the younger generation, I think there are courses that are more, I think, directed to this kind of job, right? I think which is great. And I have the opportunity to every now and again give some lectures. And it's great. But when I look back in it would have been so much easier if I had gone in this kind of a fast track into this career. But so it's been a very accidental career. I would argue that maybe it still is, but very, very fulfilling in a sense that you look at, try to make sense of what's happening in the world, and try to kind of improve decision-making processes all around.
That's great. That's an incredible journey. And I feel like if you talk to most people who found themselves in these, you either started out as a niche role, but has now expanded.
Yeah.
It isn't linear, and there wasn't a plan that, I'm going to do these things and it'll lead me here. But much in the same way, this work itself has become a focal point. It sounds like you've taken a very similar journey to it, pulling in multidisciplinary, kind of focus to come to this. So
For sure.
when you talk about this be ready, not right, how do you manage that, or what challenges do you find getting there, getting ready, being ready when there are so many different intervening issues? There are perhaps maybe not an agreed upon set of facts or understandings that would generally help set the framework for the analysis. How do you find that in this kind of, media driven, lots of information, we don't know what's true or not? How do you sort of sort through that to be ready?
No, that's a big challenge, because now, some would argue that you have, a lot of information, excess of information that you need to filter. And a lot of it, is also, may not be that accurate. And there's also a lot of, volatility overall and some short-term analysis, which again, I think important to some sectors. And if you think about more broadly, financial markets overall, some of them might have shorter term goals, which I think so. This kind of online 24/7 dynamics does work. I'm in a sector where it's longer term, right, decisions. So that makes it challenging in the sense that you need to filter a lot, the signal from the noise, right? And it is very to see what things matter, what it's really kind of the underlying drivers and trends that really matter. And again, there's no right formula, but especially so there are two things. One, it's the time frame. So if you're looking longer term, it becomes more challenging, I think, to try to identify and sift through what kind of really matters. And the second thing is understanding, what are the specific issues that you care about. Again, and then this may depend a little bit on which sector of the economy you're working on. I mean, if you're an agricultural company, there are some variables that matter more. If you're in energy, others, and so on and so forth. So I would say that there's no single method. There are tools that you can use, in terms of how you go about talking about, risk. I mean, we can talk about how we manage risk, right? The whole process, the risk management process, there are several steps to it, which, starting with kind of collecting information relevant and sifting through it to identify risks, for instance, and then there are all these other steps that we can go and talk a little bit more about. There are also, scenario work that you can try to kind of understand, not necessarily predict the future, but understand what plausible futures are there, right? That you can be, again, not right necessarily, but ready to stress test your strategy, those different futures that are out there. But I think that the main thing before you do all of that and you resort to these tools is to understand, how these, what we call geopolitics more broadly, or geopolitical volatility, or, crises, what's the connection from that relatively vague term to real world significance? Like, for instance, for me, right? So, okay, that could translate into higher costs, supply chain disruption, compliance, sanctions and compliance risks, tariffs and trade barriers, policy, regulatory volatility, uncertainty writ large, but to specific areas of the company. So that's so once you have that understanding of what transmission lines could potentially be, I think that's where you start your work. So then a little bit to, okay, what's the actual impact? So, I mean, there's a whole process. You put a dollar amount to it, or, there are other, non quantitative ways to measure as well, risk, for instance, as well. So I think in a nutshell, it's understanding a little bit why, how politics and the volatility that comes with it, these crises that we're seeing, how it translates into real world impacts for companies writ large, for investors writ large, right? And that's kind of the starting point. And sometimes it's not easy, right? I mean, especially when I told you, coming from an academic background early, sometimes you don't make those connections quite easily. You go in. So I was talk about Brazilian politics, for instance. When I started, I was focusing a lot on Brazil and Latin America, and Brazil more specifically, all the inside baseball of politics, which is great. I mean, people do it, a lot of political sciences do it, like, talk about elections and party dynamics and election dynamics. But for my work, that's relevant, but it's not the end goal, right? The end goal is, okay, why all of this matters to the decision making, process of companies, for instance, right? The investment. So it's kind of translating that connection piece there. So again, and I think now as we said, there are classes, there are courses that niche. It's a niche, still a niche, but more acknowledged one. Then in the past, I kind of accidentally stumbled into this practice.
That's great. No, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. And I'm wondering, as you talk about taking it from almost theoretical to practical or pragmatic, maybe when you're taking the political piece or the academic piece, and you have to put this all together. I mean, you have to deliver it to your point. You have to deliver it to decision makers, and it's one of many other pieces. So how do you see that role in kind of bringing that together, making it relevant and practical solutions. Or I think you were sort of saying there's going to be many, you're maybe running different scenarios or hypotheticals. How do you kind of distill that in a way that it can be easily digestible for decision makers and they have the ability to understand what are they actually need to think about when they're contemplating their strategic initiatives or other business decisions, when you're in front of in that room with other people also trying to influence decision?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, and a very relevant one. I think acknowledging that, I think leaders today and business leaders, they acknowledge the importance of it, of this discussion, of course. I mean, it's, again, these are, we're talking companies, leading companies from around the world. They do, they've managed this for quite some time, and they know the relevance of it. But that is not to say that they're comfortable with the process overall, right? I mean, there's a sense of talking about risk and talking about uncertainty. You have to feel comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, right? And that's not, I'm not saying that the risk team in a specific company or a specific sector is the bearer of bad news, not necessarily. Again, but some might think so, right? Because we're always, stress testing ideas and assumptions, et cetera. So there is that a little bit that, once the leadership acknowledges and appreciates that, I think then you have room to do what you have to do, right? It's not necessarily agree with everything that's here. There's no risk. We can do it. We can mitigate. We can avoid, etc. But there is this element which is important to acknowledge, that the feeling comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, accepting that level of uncertainty and and challenges, right? Because you're always also there to I think challenge assumptions and reduce the risk of cognitive bias and groupthink. So this is kind of as a backdrop to this discussion, right? And that is to say, but again, also that's not to say that you're there just to say, just to be a devil's advocate, right? I think you're there also to try to be more proactive and okay, so what do we do, right? It's not just flag the risks and leave the room and you guys deal with it. It's come with more concrete recommendations. So there are ways to go about doing this, right? And I think there are multiple ways to go about doing this. So one example, when you talk about risk management, right, in the corporation, and corporations, the way that they do it is maybe slightly different, because they're all different types of risks. They're legal, fiscal, operational, and which have very clear methodologies. The geopolitical risk tends to be a little bit on the fuzzier end of the spectrum in terms of, okay, what do you mean by it exactly and how it impacts? But that said, so one example is the risk process that I mentioned is you start with first having a kind of not a siloed approach. It has to be, cross different teams within the corporation, because risk affects, as we talked earlier on, multiple facets of the business, right, at the same time. So it needs to be a cross-functional effort, number one, with the support of the leadership, of course. And then you start with, collecting information from different sides of the business, corporate functions, affiliates, from depending on how big the company is, but also external as well. To your point before, filtering, from the news, like relevant news and research and all that. So that's kind of part of what we call the risk, the first step, which is the risk discovery, right? Essentially, kind of you cast a wide net and you try to identify what's key, but then that's just the first step. And then the second step is, okay, once we have that long list of issues that may matter, we need to start assessing it. What's the impact of that? So you have to kind of describe very clearly, if X happens, the consequence will be Y. And then it could be that, so that's a whole discussion on how you describe that specific risk, for instance. And then there could be a number attached to it, right? So what's the impact in terms of dollar amounts or financial impact? Or, there's also some more like indirect or non-financial consequences as well that you can try to measure. It could be reputation, could be something else. So that's also bringing what began as an abstract issue into a more concrete risk with very concrete impacts. And then what do you do how do you manage that? Do you monitor? Are there ways to mitigate, et cetera? So that's a little bit in a nutshell, the step by step. And then, hopefully in that the end result, you have a number of, say, risks, and then you communicate that. But it's an ongoing process. You do that every year, but you do throughout the year because risks change. All these events that I mentioned the last 6 years, for instance, they move things around. But you try to have a longer term view. That's just one tool, right? There are other like scenario foresight, et cetera, the tools that are also useful as well.
That's actually very interesting, and it does in some ways mirror sort of a legal analysis, right? You sort of do that discovery first, like what do we know, what don't we know, and then go through it. It just with different inputs, and much more, I think, complex analysis. To be clear,
and no, exactly. And now I think the challenge, given everything we talked about the environment being more geopolitically, volatile and uncertain, it forces companies to have a more robust process of risk management, be more proactive as well. It's not just kind of sitting down and things happen and you have to, we need to mitigate and we need to understand what happened. That's part of the process. But I mean, more and more, we have dedicated teams and also consulting firms that do this, right? I mean, as well, but dedicated teams whose job is to be more proactive as well, and always try to again, not even though it's easy to say that the job is to predict, and great. I mean, if you predict, it's wonderful, but the job is not to be right necessarily. Again, as it's to be ready to face whatever happens. So that's so it needs to be also in. So it's the fine balance of being creative on the one hand, because you need to think about things that are, could be sometimes outside of the box thinking, but at the same time being business relevant as well. So there's a sweet spot there that's not trivial to reach.
And I guess I assume those factors sort of balance out. Industry matters probably, and as you were saying, in certain industries, long-term projections or long-term analysis is more critical, a little bit harder. And so how do you find, like you've been in a number of different, sort of cross industries or different spaces, are you easily able to kind of pivot and sort of figure out what you have to do differently? So same maybe mindset or same kind of 4 points that you're going to go through, but how you weight those or how you evaluate what's more significant based on industry or depending on, I guess, who you're advising. How challenging is that to kind of pivot? I mean, I would find it incredibly challenging, which is why I'm asking.
No, yes. If I could answer just with a yes.
Yes, fine.
But no. But no, it is challenging. But all jokes aside, no, it's challenging because even, I mean, within a company, right? I mean, there are different, I mean, in working, for instance, a company that's kind of a big company with different business lines that operate slightly in different sectors or different areas. I mean, one thing is, okay, a risk pertains to that specific business line or that specific sector, right? But then the other sector might have slightly different view of the same event, right? So taking a step back, so if you're doing for a corporation as a whole, right, that has all these different footprints around the world, it's challenging because, I mean, to put it very in kind of make the contrast easier, one event happens, that event might be positive, have a net positive effect on one sector and a net negative on the other sector. And I don't know, a company might be present in those two sectors, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you manage that? So it is a process, as I said, and some big companies, they do have like a matrix system where, each of these business lines or functions, they do their own risk process, focusing on what's important to them directly, but then you can add a layer on top of that. Okay, so great, what's important to the corporation as a whole? So some of those risks might make the cut, others might not. But again, there's some degree of, there always will be some contradiction, I think, to an extent, but that you can manage and you can reduce. But as long as you're clear about, okay, this event might have a positive impact on this sector, but we need to spell out all the potential repercussions. So when we go about doing risk and identifying risk and assessing risk, we put kind of the hat of the worst credible scenario, right? I mean, that's kind of a and once you do that, you have to flesh out all the possible scenarios that stem from it, right? Some of them might be more positive or more negative, but that's part of the process. And again, in acknowledging to what I said before, the feeling comfortable with being uncomfortable, I think that's part of it as well, right? And I think that's part of the process. But of course, it depends a lot on the sector that you work and the size of the company and how the company's footprint is. Some might be more straightforward, right? But if this happened, the transmission line from a risk to specific company is very straight and very, very, very straightforward. Whereas in other areas, it might be, less direct. And then you have to, it's hard. That's why you require, as I said, a cross-functional exercise with different people with different expertise to think about these. Oh, wait, but this may happen as well. This is something that we weren't thinking, right? But then put that into like a very simple way to communicate upwards that the relevance of that, it's very challenging. It's kind of it's never perfect, and it's always trying to make it more business relevant and be more direct and objective as possible, right?
And I imagine you have some limited time to communicate that. And so you have to kind of know what you're going into. And sounds like what you're, sort of talking about is you're evaluating each risk or each event, but then you're also evaluating the risk against the risks, right? Because each
Oh
sector
yeah.
might have the same. And now you have to make judgments about which risk actually outweighs for a global. And I think that's the kind of national corporation complexity and multi-strategy complexity, right? There's different businesses, to your point, doing different things, and it may be a positive here, maybe neutral, and then pulling all of that together, incredibly complex. So I wanted to touch, you mentioned up front, and I thought this was really interesting, and I think you were talking about it both in how this industry, which was at one, not industry, this sort of study and this risk management, it's maybe now better defined as strategic foresight, as you've mentioned, but that these shocks that we've had over the recent years, and a lot of them in this short period of time, have impacted how we view this, strategic risk, et cetera. Do you see the current sort of crises that we're seeing in the news as a new shock, or do those shocks that we've experienced kind of just inform how we deal with what's going on today?
I mean, it's would be easier to answer that question, 10 years from now. Uh,
Well, I'll ask it. I know it's
no,
a terrible question to ask
no, but
as
it
it's
is.
happening.
Yeah, no, it is challenging. I mean, again, if we were talking, 6.5 years ago about the risk of a pandemic, right?
Right.
And it came, and again, once in a century, and then everything that has happened, sometimes it's hard to, and that's I think part of the job is to take a step back and see how unusual or how much of a new thing this is, right? Or is this just yet another chapter of a sequence of crises? No, I think there's definitely something in the last 6 years or so that we've seen some trends that becoming more, intense in terms of, I mean, political policy volatility. We've seen this playing out in many issues. So, look, when you look at so when I was, in school and starting out, we used to talk about kind of globalization, the order that was put in place after the Second World War, right? 1945, the UN, all the economic infrastructure around it, right? On the World Bank and the IMF, and then the World Trade Organization. So a world where we had growing levels of integration, globalization, and companies becoming more global because, supply chains interconnecting the world, so that was kind of a paradigm, right? For much of the second half of last century into the first couple of decades of this century. And then suddenly we've seen over the last, I don't know, I'd say the last 10 years or so, and especially over the last 5 years, a big inflection point, right? And then there's a question on that. Some are saying about what we call a fragmented world. some are calling deglobalization. I think there's still some maybe exaggeration of that term. However, is this an inflection point where we see kind of at least what we call integration and globalization kind of stall? And now maybe could potentially, is this where are we going from here? Because you can see numbers were showing that there's integration has some, or globalization has somewhat stalled, not necessarily backtracked, but stalled and maybe changing format where you're having more, instead of more global multilateral deals, you have more regional deals. But then the question is, okay, is this just a blip? And then we'll see things business as usual in a few years' time, or is this an inflection point where we start seeing, things maybe deglobalizing or becoming more fragmented? I don't have the answer to that yet, but I do think that, given what we've seen, this is something more than a blip, right? It seems, first and foremost. And I think with respect to kind of the political crisis as well, I think we've seen more and more often. I think maybe we'll look, a few years' time to these last few years that we've seen global politics overall as a very turbulent times. And comparing just with I don't know, we had big geopolitical shocks over the last 20, 30 years. It's not a matter of not having them, because putting my skeptical hat on as well, there's always every time someone talks about geopolitics for the last 50 plus years, always starts with, the world has never been so complex geopolitically, right? So I think that's part of the, and again, we are again saying this.
I was going to say, I think I probably said it and asked you that question.
Exactly. And it's part of it. But definitely, I think there's something kind of, it seems the last given all what I listed to you in the last 6 years, there's something that it's becoming more impactful. So if it's game changing overall, or the beginning of a new massive geopolitical shock, I don't know. But I do think that the impacts they're having in current decision-making processes in the world and people's lives, it definitely felt more than in the past, right? Even if you think about the crisis in the 70s in the energy sector, for instance, there are all these variables that show that, the impact of current crises the last few years that I've mentioned on supply chains and costs, et cetera, it seems to be more relevant. But yeah, that's a good question. One thing that I wanted to flag as well, you mentioned that just reminded me of kind of how you prioritize the risks. And so, the end result of that this identification process that I mentioned is basically a very simple risk matrix, right? Where you kind of have, like one axis is the likelihood, from lower to higher, the other axis is impact, right, from low to high. So with that, you can, all those issues that you've discovered, and as you put a number onto them, right, you place them in the likelihood of them occurring, they're kind of placing in the matrix. So that is a simple way to prioritize, right? But again, each business line may have a different matrix, right? So you have a multitude of, but what determines is what are you paying attention first is those that are kind of in the higher likelihood and a higher consequence. So I think that now, long-winded answer to your question of are we facing a new shock? I don't know if shocks it would be the word to describe right now, but definitely there's more volatility that we were seeing than in the past, for sure.
Thank you. And I know it's a challenging question, but it's so interesting to me how many of these, as you're going through them, have happened in such what appears or feels like living in a very short period of time, like sort of recent history. And is it the indication of that change you're talking about from the paradigm shift from, post World War II? Are we in a paradigm shift? And I'm just incredibly fascinated by it. And I'm just wondering on just a little bit more on that side. Is there something to the uncertainty? Like, when we talk about complexity, is it also complexity because there is so much uncertainty and things shift so quickly, or is that not really a sort of an impact or impactful in the decision, in the analysis or decision making?
No, it is. I mean, especially if you're thinking about like longer term decisions, right? Or long-term investments where, you make a decision and that investment will, you're planning for decades long investments, these uncertainties, they do matter. Sometimes, even, you make decisions not thinking about how the world is today, right? But you think about how the world's going to look like in in 20, 30, 40 years, which is challenging. So you need to, sometimes kind of maybe downplay some of the bad news in the short term, or some of the good news in the short term, because you're thinking, okay, what's the trend? What's the longer term view of this? So it is definitely more complex. It's harder to understand a little bit what the impact is. So yeah, and this complexity, I don't know, again, it might be something of perception. It feels that a lot, because of the pace of information, nowadays, and the way that people communicate, the way that people consume their news, it seems to be, everything seems to be moving a little bit on faster pace. And again, that makes sense, and that's beneficial to a lot of, I'm not kind of criticizing this at all, but that makes sense to a lot of different sectors and different industries and people's lives, all the benefits that come from it. But for those who are looking longer term, it becomes more challenging, because sometimes it just becomes harder for you to kind of try to sift through and try to understand what's the underlying kind of drivers and more structural trends that, for at least for your business, might be the most important things to look for.
Yeah, I imagine that is incredibly challenging. And I am going to just pause for a second, because we do have a question, and I want to encourage everybody to share your questions as they come up. We will have time at the end as well. But let me just share with you. We have a request that if you could mention one or two examples that maybe ExxonMobil face, on a specific country or in a specific region, and without being, I know we have to be sort of careful about talking about, current activity or geopolitics as it relates to your specific role, but just maybe more macro on what that might look like.
Yeah, no, and of course, I mean, I can't mention any specifics, but
Right.
but big picture of any big investor in specific countries. If you look back, decades ago, I mean, you're always looking to see, how that can. So a few key variables, right? When you make an investment in a country, and then you have many historical examples, not only from the energy sector, right, from across the board. Of course, you look at the macroeconomic variables of that country, fiscal dynamics, debt, whether that country has, what's the trade dynamics of that country? Does it have a trade deals or not? Is it an open economy or not? So there are all these macroeconomic variables that matter. Plus, the legal variables, investment treaties, contract sanctity, and those elements that lawyers know well about. And then the political end, that's where kind of was the newer variable, so to speak, that we talked about, how the political industry came to be. Was okay, because the macroeconomy and the legal analysis tend to give you more of a kind of a snapshot of sorts, whereas the political analysis gives you a little bit more of the dynamic view of how that plays out. Because you might have a snapshot of political forces in a specific country. Some might be more pro-investment, others might be more anti, or more protectionist, or more open, free trade, et cetera. So those are kind of very simple descriptions. So the political analysis gives you a little bit of the dynamics of how, what's happening, that, this, even though that one of these political forces might not be in power, they may be in power in a few years' time. And giving an example from my previous life of, Eurasia Group, for instance, doing country risk analysis for different areas, different companies. And it was challenging because some clients of Eurasia Group, they had more shorter term views or interests, which is legitimate. Others had longer term. So it was challenging to kind of, okay, what does it mean, and read. But yeah, they're always looking to see, how predictable government would be in terms of implementing policies. How predictable in terms of, are they going to try to implement what they are promising in the campaign, right, in the electoral campaign? Number one. Number two, how how able would they be to implement? Because one thing is to try to do what you say and be honest with your, what you promise to do in an election, implement during the government. But then there's a question of capabilities as well. I mean, does that government has a majority? Do they have a majority in Congress or not? Is it a minority government, which also impacts? And then what the economy of that country looks like, and where are the risks of something happening in terms of trade? And does that country have, is it an energy independent country or not? So there are all these variables. So I mean, sorry not to go into specific examples, but you can kind of, looking at the news of the last 20 plus years, see, that's play out, that dynamics plays out all over the world, including the US, but all over the world. I mean, those doubts, those uncertainties. So the job is to kind of try to anticipate that and try to understand what those political uncertainties are and what can you do to mitigate that for your, investment decision in a specific country.
Thank you. I know it's challenging. We always face the same issues as well, and we can't talk specifically about our company, but I appreciate the context because I do think that really helps evaluate, or helps us understand how you evaluate in each of these regions and thinking. I think the way you broke that down, right, is what do they say? What could they do? What's the likelihood that they'll do it? And then what could they do even if they wanted to?
Yeah. And what are the quote unquote, I mean, for the lack of better, like the black swans, all those unthinkable events
Right.
that might happen. I mean, does that country, does it have a contention with a neighboring country or not? Could there be a war, right? Or something like
Right.
that. So all these other things, could that country be invaded or something like that? So there are all these different examples. So that's why I think it's very challenging. There's no single formula to do it, and of course, depends on the moment and depends on the geography, but in the sector as well.
And I imagine it changes as the as it
Yeah,
changes as the world changes in each of those. And I completely understand why you have people like focused on region, focused on country, focused on all of those ways those things interconnect. I think you could go on, at least for me, and I'm not somebody who works in this space, but everything has another like a bolt-on effect, and there's all of these
exactly.
secondary and tertiary considerations. You make a decision here, what does that mean for your neighbors, for your larger out, looking even further outward? So I would imagine that analysis could be never ending unless you are able to say, okay, we've now done what we can. We have to deliver something. Like, what does this actually mean? Like, so what all these things happen, what do we do now?
Yeah, no, and it's not about, I mean, you have to have imagination for sure, but it's also you need to kind of, have put on your feet in the ground to kind of, okay, bring this back and okay, what
Right.
does this mean? So it's not easy to have those two kind of
No.
characteristics, right? Of kind of trying to, so it is personally challenging, but at the same time, I think interesting kind of journey to do that, to having these kind of being able to give free rein to think a little bit about, outside the box, but then kind of bring it back in, right? And it's not a comfortable exercise that I would say, because sometimes the stepping outside of the box and having those crazy discussions, for instance,
Mhm.
that's very uncomfortable as we talked about, right?
Right.
But if you have the end goal in mind, which is at the end of this, we'll bring it back in and be very objective, then the process works, right? But you need to allow for that kind of outside of the box, or some call it the blue sky thinking, where you kind of,
Yes.
free yourself of the constraints of the day to day, of
Right.
budgets and, things
Right.
like that, and just let your mind roam a little bit, but then bring back. Again, it's very challenging because either you don't have the leeway to do that,
Right.
or you're just unwilling to be that creative.
Right.
Um, and or you're not able to bring back to do something relevant, so you're just kind of telling stories and you're the
Right.
storyteller of the group, and people's like, oh, here he comes again,
Right.
the long story to tell.
What journey
uh
will we take today?
yeah,
But
hopefully
not
I'm not
further
seeing like
us.
that. Yeah, hopefully I'm
Right.
not seeing like that, but I try to balance those two
Yeah.
characteristics.
Yeah, it's incredibly challenging when you try to bring that in-house, right, into an industry where you are actually, kind of, you need to advise, right? So it's all very, interesting, and it you could go on and on, and but to pull it back, to have those two skill sets, I think is incredibly unique. And so it sounds like you've brought them together incredibly well. I think we do sort of like no bad idea, safe space, like bring it all in into one space and like say it. But then at some point, there are bad, we've got to stop. We have to stop the discussion. It's hard to do that. So amazing that you're able to do it. And I know so I'm looking at the time. I know we don't have a lot left, but I did want to sort of ask you about resiliency and how we think about that. today versus what we might have thought, even pre-pandemic. What does
Yeah.
that look like? That word gets used a lot, I think. And I don't know that we always sort of all interpret it in the same way, but what does it mean to you? How do you think about it today?
Yeah, I mean, there's personal resilience, which was another discussion of, and kind of what we talked a little bit about, which is, trying to, make sense of the world and being kind of, being try to have clarity in where you want to go and how you'd go about your own work. And even though the world seems to be much more complicated, at least to not let that overwhelm you. No, so there's a resilience from a
Right.
personal point of view when dealing with political risk, which it can be challenging because I mean, your part of your job is to look at bad news, right?
Right.
And risks and uncertainties. So that can be, from a personal point of view, that can be challenging. Um, Maybe I should have done architecture or something like I did in the past. But also in terms of business and especially when you look at the economy, right? And we talked about these shocks and how these geopolitical shocks are affecting how countries relate to each other and how companies operate. For a long time, when we mentioned this post the Second World War order, right, economic order of, integration, globalization, free trade, etc., where a lot of the main drivers for companies that, major multinational was efficiency in a way. So you go and produce an asset or produce a product in different countries. You have supply chains, right? So you have different supply chains and connections. So efficiency, 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 and
Mhm.
with the assumption that you could do that, you can reach out, you could go to different markets and all of that with not a lot of obstacles and restrictions. Now, given has happened in the last few years and the uncertainty around that it's not that you're abandoning efficiency or not abandoning, but you're adding this new element of resiliency, I think, which is okay, I need supply chains that are not only efficient, but they're also resilient in the sense that if something were to happen, I mean, let's say an extreme case of a war, for instance, but then there are other things of sanctions or the tariffs and or the pandemic that happened that affected the like personal health equipment. Um, so I think the resilience is also having this kind of a redundancies and supply chains and so I think that's how I interpret the term when it comes to just the supply chains, which for a multinational corporation is important,
Sure.
supply chains and how if you operate in multiple markets at the same time. So that's one of the how I see it now and becoming more and more important as the world continues to be somewhat fragmented.
Yeah, no, I think we use it so much in all different ways, and sometimes I think or maybe it used to feel reactive, and now it feels like just part of the proactive preparation. Your point about being ready, not right, and like all of those things that
Yeah,
lead to that resiliency has become such a part of the daily strategy, right? We're planning, I think, more than we ever have for these
yeah,
potential events, but that wasn't, it didn't feel like that was part of the calculus, 6, 7, 10 years ago. Sounds
yeah.
like that, you would say that that shifts as well in sort of the corporate setting.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's exactly it. And again, I think the word that summarizes is challenging, right? It's challenging, and there's no single formula to deal with that challenge. So I think certain level of open-mindedness, of flexibility, I think,
Mm.
and hope. I think it's big ingredients for you to try to, do your best.
Well, thank you so much. I don't think we have any further questions, and I know we have come to time. Um, João, I cannot thank you enough for your incredible insight, your willingness to just talk to us openly, explain really challenging and difficult concepts, especially as we're in it, we're living it, we're experiencing it, and hearing your kind of voice of stability and hopefulness actually is quite calming and reinforces that we've been through things, we have been through things we haven't expected, we will continue to do it, and we have a way to manage all of that. I'm so thankful for your time and for your sharing your incredible experience and expertise. So thank you so much.
No, it was my pleasure, and thank you for the discussion, and thank you again for the Tennessee World Affairs Council, and hopefully doing it in person next time. That will be a pleasure as well. It was really great to talk about these issues without, at least hoping that people now understand a little bit more what it is than when I started talking about this 20 plus years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, really enjoyed the
Absolutely.
conversation. Really enjoyed
Thank
it.
you so much. Thank you so much. And Leanne, I know we are going to turn it back over to you to close us out.
Thank you, João and Carolyn, for this important presentation and dialogue. I'm sure our members and attendees will enjoy it very much, and even seeing it again, because this program will be archived and available on TNWAC.org. So we invite you to consider becoming a member and a donor in support of the Tennessee World Affairs Council and its mission to advance understanding of global affairs through impactful programs and events. Thank you so much for both of you, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.